being a mod, it was not like a sort of a financial thing or a sort of a status thing in that way. It was just being aware, being part of the in crowd, being just that one step ahead.
Welcome to the podcast, Andrew. It's great to meet you, and this is great. I'm looking forward to talking Small Faces and Faces.
Brilliant, yeah.
Great introduction in the book that I think is important to understand the story of Small Faces as far as where they form and when they form. When you hear about or you read about 1960s British youth culture, the word we often hear is mod, and that's an abbreviation for the word modern, as in modern fashion, modern music, and
Modernist.
scooters.
It was short for modernist.
Right. So you write, quote, "This was our tribe, our time, our generation." Can you take us back to that time?
Yeah, I mean, I was never 100% mod because I had a big Honda 305 motorbike and all the sort of little mods had Lambrettas. But I went for the Honda option because the Beach Boys did a song called Little Honda. Well, you know that one. But yeah, I mean, to me, I mean, being a mod, it was not like a sort of a financial thing or a sort of a status thing in that way. It was just being aware. You know what I mean? Being part of the in crowd, being just that one step ahead, and like the in crowd. That was the kind of thing. You always knew the latest dances, you always knew the latest moves, you always had the latest clothes, all this kind of thing. I mean, there was Mick Jagger sang "Paint It Black" on top of the pops, and he wore a floral silk shirt, right? So the very next day, I went into town and I bought a silk floral shirt, just like Mick Jagger, and I had the little cravat, and I had the sort of mustard-coloured PVC jacket, and I had the sort of tight hipster trousers that were so tight I could barely sit down, and I had the Cuban heels, pointed toe shoes, just like the Beatles wore, with all the buckles up the side, So I mean, I was never totally in mod, but I was definitely, you're into all the sort of Motown and the Stax records. I mean, that was part of it. And there was, there were a number of little mod bands knocking about, the Attack, Action, Gino Washington, the Ram Jam Band, Zoot Money, Georgie Fame. They're all kind of mod bands. And of course, the Who. I mean, they became the sort of leading sort of mod band, and the Small Faces. I mean, they were in there. I mean, Faces. I mean, I don't know whether you know, but the Who, when they were the high numbers, they did a single called "I'm the Face," which means I'm the mod. I'm the sort of trendsetter. That's what it meant. And that's where the name Small Faces comes from, because I mean they were small in stature, yeah.
Well, that was the other thing. Yeah, they're little guys.
Yeah, but they were kind of trendsetters as well. And the first record was "What You Gonna Do About It," which I mean now they have sampling technology, don't they, where they sort of sample old records and all this kind of thing and remix them and put them all together in new configurations. Well, of course, that technology did not exist in those days. But the Small Faces took the rhythm from Solomon Burke's "Everybody Needs Somebody to Love." You know that one?
Yeah.
And they took the title of a Doris Troy song, "What You Gonna Do About It?" and they put the two together, and Steve Marriott did a really long extended sort of guitar solo in the middle, which had a really long sort of extended note, and that made it pop art or op art. And that was basically the first single, and it sort of charted. It got into the top 20, and it sort of broke down, and they became sort of, they sort of broke through.
And Jimmy Winston was at that time, he was on keyboards. The original lineup featured who? It was Ronnie Lane, Kenney Jones.
Yeah, and Steve Marriott.
Yes.
Yeah, and Jimmy Winston. Yeah, but there was, you would have thought that with such a spectacular breakthrough single, that the follow-up would have sort of charted as well. But I mean, it was a very competitive period. There were a lot of bands coming out with a lot of sort of first-class recordings. And the second Small Faces record was "I Got Mine," which was a very good record. It was extremely compressed sound, and it was a beautifully constructed little record. But for one reason or another, it it failed to chart. I mean, there was a movie called Dateline for Diamonds, and they briefly appeared in that doing I Got Mine with Jimmy Winston in the lineup. And I don't know whether you're aware of the pirate radio station phenomenon in the UK.
Oh yeah, yeah. And there was a great movie on that too, about maybe 10 years ago, maybe more now. But yeah, as a longtime radio guy, I'm always fascinated with that story of pirate radio.
Yeah, I mean, like at the beginning of the 60s, all there was the BBC. The BBC had a monopoly. There were no commercial stations whatsoever. And the BBC had a kind of a patronizing attitude to pop music. Pop music is sort of a faddy thing, for kids. And they never took it seriously. So, particularly when the Beatles happened and the whole thing exploded and there were new bands coming and there were new records, all this sort of thing, the BBC got kind of very quickly outdated. So you got all these like pirate radio stations who were on boats,
Literally on ships. Yeah.
on ships outside the territorial limits. So they were not subject to British law and they could get advertising and then they could broadcast all these obscure records, and that's how, it was vital for all of us kids at the time, to sort of hear all this music. And yeah, I say, despite all that, I Got Mine sort of failed and disappeared. And that's more or less when Jimmy Winston sort of quit and went sideways. I mean, there's been lots of sort of, why did he leave? Was he pushed? All this kind of thing. And I prefer to think of it as, like when Ringo Starr replaced Pete
Pete
Best,
Best. Yeah.
the Beatles. I mean, John Lennon, in a rare moment of tact, he said, "Well, Pete Best was a good drummer, but Ringo Starr was a good Beatle." And I think it was the same with, Jimmy
In
was a good keyboard player, but Ian McLagan, he was a good small face. He fitted the image, he fitted the whole thing. So the next single was, I mean, they're obviously looking around. It sort of needed something to recoup that lost momentum. So they selected a song by Kenny Lynch. I don't know whether you probably don't know who Kenny Lynch is, but
no.
he was a popular sort of a popular guy in the UK. He was one of the first sort of black sort of stars in pop music. I mean, he had a number of sort of hit singles in his own right, including a cover of Up on the Roof, The Drifters Up on the Roof. And he had Puff Up in Smoke, not the Peter Paul and Mary song. And he did You Can Never Stop Me Loving You. That was a big hit for him in the UK. But he was actually he actually toured with the Beatles, one of the very very earliest Beatles tours, when there was Helen Shapiro, who was a big teenage star in the UK at the time. She was topping the bill. The Beatles were supporting, and there was Kenny Lynch at the bottom. And of course, the Beatles, Lennon and McCartney, they wanted to become. I mean, they asked Paul McCartney, what's going to happen when the Beatles bubble bursts? And he said, we want to become like Goffin and King. We want to write songs for the people. So they were keen to sort of get their songs across to other artists to record. And they wrote a song called Misery, which is on the first Beatles album. And they wrote it specifically for Helen Shapiro. But Helen Shapiro turned it down, or her management turned it down. But Kenny Lynch was listening and he thought, good song that. So he actually recorded it himself. And he was the first guy to actually do a cover version of a Beatles song.
Interesting piece of trivia. Yeah, rock history
Yeah.
trivia there.
And anyway, he was, he'd written this song called Shalala Shalala Lee.
Right, that's Small Faces' second single.
That was a small
Right?
faces hit single, yeah. And I mean, there was like Do Wah Diddy Diddy, there was Da Do Ron Ron, all these sort of things, they didn't really mean anything, but they sort of sounded good. And Shalala Lee was the same kind of thing. But and it was sort of a light, catchy pop song. But if you listen to the lyrics, it's sort of like he goes, picked her up on a Friday night. I knew everything was going to be all right. But it sounds, but it's just like the mates were talking in the pub. You know, it was like he was in that sort of demotic sort of way of talking. Just like two guys talking. Oh yeah, I met this bird. You know, picked her up on a Friday night. Knew everything was going to be all right. You know, that kind of sort of simple dialogue that people could connect to. And I said, "Where do you want to go?" She said, "Somewhere. I don't know." You know, it's kind of a naturalistic dialogue. And Steve Marriott, he gave it a really good, vocal performance. And it sort of went into the charts and got to number two. It was a big hit. After that, it was all self-written material for the single.
Right. Well, that wasn't that a frustration early on? They said we want to write our own stuff.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, everybody sort of starts out doing covers. You
Right.
know, Beatles started doing covers, the Stones started doing covers, everyone started doing covers. But eventually, you've got to sort of move on and write your own material. Like Andrew Lowe Oldham said, he said, there's not an endless reservoir of old blues songs, old R&B songs to cover. You've got to write your own songs. So the first one was All or Nothing, which was a brilliant single, which sort of caught that sort of mod moment to perfection. And decades ago, Frank Sinatra did a song called All or Nothing at All. So whether they sort of got that title and thought, good title. So,
Well, speaking of that, I was going to ask you about the first album, the self-titled debut, May 11th, 1966. It was recorded or
yeah.
released, and there's a song in there, and you write about this in the book. This has What You're Gonna Do About It, and Sha La La Lee is on there, number 3 album, by the way. But I was listening on Spotify, and I'm listening, and I'm thinking, boy, this one song sounds familiar. It sounds like the lyrics to Led Zeppelin's Whole Lot of Love, you know? And sure enough, you cover it in the book, and you write, quote, "This epic recording has a complex history as well as a litigious future." So what's the story behind this song, You Need Loving? It dates back to even before Small Faces?
Oh yeah. Like I say, the What You're Gonna Do About It was sort of taking a bit from Solomon Burke, and certainly they were sort of taking bits from like Muddy Waters and all things like that. Muddy Waters and B.B. King. They were taking things from there, and you can trace roots back through that. But yeah, You Need Loving was a brilliant performance. And obviously, Jimmy Page was a session musician. He was knocking around at the time. He was listening. He was thinking, "Hey, pretty good song, this." So yeah, if you listen to the Led Zeppelin track, it's sort of note for note.
Yeah.
Nick,
The
that's it.
way down inside.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's where you hear the similarities.
They got the original "You Need Love" when Muddy Waters recorded a Willie Dixon song. So you could say that both the Small Faces and Led Zeppelin were both plundering black music. Whether the Small Faces were like a sort of a connection. They're both plundering black music in a sense. But yeah, the Small Faces, you had All or Nothing. That was a number one. In fact, that knocked the Beatles' Yellow Submarine off the top, off the top of the charts. That was the first number one. And the title, the headline in the music press then was "Faces Sink Sub."
Ah,
So,
I love it.
yeah, I thought was quite nice. And they had other hits after that, Hey Girl, My Mind's Eye. And
Right,
then,
right. Which is on the compilation album that came next, right? From the beginning, or it was released that same month,
yeah, yeah,
but just a
yeah.
different label. I think that's what it was. They changed labels, so the new label they wanted to get caught up on the back catalog and put it all on one album.
Oh, yeah. They were signed to Don Arden, who, as we all know, was some kind of a gangster figure. And
Right, Decca Records was the first label they were on.
the first
Okay,
label,
so they left Decca, then
and
went on to another label. Okay,
Don Arden negotiated a deal with Decca, and Don Arden, he gave them credit cards so they could go down Carnaby Street and get all the latest mod gear, for the photo shoots. He gave them that, and also he gave them a house to live in, like the Monkeys, where you all live together in the house. Although Ian McLagan was actually 16 years old, he was too young, so he was technically living with his parents. But and then Don Arden put them on a wage. They'd on like 35 quid a week or something like that. and they had number one hit. Yeah, the number one hit record, and you're still getting the same money. You know, I mean, bands have always been screwed up, haven't they? You know, since the beginning of the record industry. You know, because when you're young, if they put a contract in front of you, you'll sign anything just to get your name on that record. And then later on, you know, when you're sort of topping tours, topping tours, and you got big selling records, you think, hang on a minute, where's all this money going to? And you start to think, hang on a minute, we've been screwed here. So yeah, he went through a long legal process to get out of Don Arden's contract and out of Decca Records, and they re-signed to Andrew Loog Oldham's Immediate. Because Andrew Loog Oldham, he'd been the Rolling Stones manager. He was a smart, hip young gunslinger, and he wanted to create his own record label with a kind of a family vibe, like Motown. I mean, not in the sense of being, black artists like Motown, but with that same sort of family feel, and and he could speak a good line, he could seduce the bands. And I think basically, well intentioned, that's what he wanted. And Immediate, obviously there's Rolling Stones money back there. And the Rolling Stones were writing hits for like Marianne Faithfull and Chris Farlow, and so there was Immediate Records, and the Small Faces signed to Immediate, and the very first single was "Here Come the Nice," which was a sort of an extension on what they'd done. It was their own song, but it was like a little bit more experimental, a little bit more way out.
They don't have any money, and yet they've got a bunch of hit singles. "Hey Girl" was number 10. "My Mind's Eye" was number 4. "All or Nothing" number 1, which, by the way, that was written by Steve Marriott and Ronnie Lane. And you say that song is the undisputed peak of the band's period recording with Decca. Expand on that a little bit. Why do you feel that way?
Well, I mean, Paul Weller took that little guitar lick, and he used that on one of his solo records. It was tight. It was well produced. It was a brilliant little song. I mean, you just see the video of them performing all or nothing, and they're bright and sharp and young and hip, and it's all in there in that like 2.5 minutes or whatever. It's a brilliant little single.
Itchycoo Park, number 3. "Tin Soldier," we haven't talked about yet, a number 9 single. Itchycoo Park ends up hitting number 16 in the U.S., which I think might have been their first U.S. hit single.
It was the only American.
Only. Yeah, the book that Ronnie claimed to have adapted the melody from an old hymn called "God Be in My Head," and then as a starting point, took a handful of phrases from a magazine feature he'd found in a Bristol hotel room. That's cool. And sonically, it features something called phasing or flanging. Can you explain what that is, how they get that effect? Because this is pre-Pro Tools era. This is not the technology of today. And I know this little trick from my radio days, but if you can explain how you get that flanging sound.
Briefly, phasing became the sound. All the bands wanted it. I mean, the Beatles did it on "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." Status Quo did it on "Pictures of Matchstick Men." But I think Itchycoo Park with Small Faces was the best use of phasing. Essentially, I mean, you got like 24-track recording equipment at that time, and what you did, you got two tapes
right on top of each other,
thing running slightly out of phase.
Yeah.
So sort of hissing, surging, warping sound, which I say briefly became the sort of the sound of 67.
And "Tin Soldier" is, quote, "the greatest 3 minutes 16 seconds that the Small Faces ever recorded, and one of the greatest tracks of the 1960s. Explain why you feel that way. A very complex, layered mix of things we hear in here. Speaking of production."
Yeah. I mean, it was a highly competitive time. I mean, all the bands were trying to get that one step ahead. I mean, the Yardbirds were there. They were pushing the envelope. Obviously the Beatles and the Stones were there. And the Who. I mean, it was a very competitive time, and all your career resided on that next single if it got in the charts. So there was a there's lots at stake. And I mean, there was one interesting thing about Here Comes the Night. I mean, the BBC. I mean, they were very sort of sensitive about any drug references. I mean, when Sergeant Pepper came out, they banned Day in the Life because of the supposed drug reference, but they missed it. But they missed out entirely that Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds spelled LSD.
Right.
You know, and when you listen to Here Comes the Night, he said, here comes, here comes the night, looking so cool. He's always there when I need some speed. I mean, that's a direct drug reference, but
Yeah.
they don't seem to have noticed that.
Tin,
Yeah,
oh, Tin Soldier. I was gonna, but yeah, talk about Tin Soldier, the production on that.
yeah.
Which, by the way, I think was recorded at Olympic Studios, the legendary Olympic Studios in London.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it was based on the story, the Hans Christian Andersen story about the Tin Soldier. Well, say Andrew Lowe Oldham's idea for immediate was all the artists should work together, and Steve Marriott and Ronnie Lane appear on the Rolling Stones album, their Satanic Majesties. They sing on a track there. They all work together. And I hear there was P.P. Arnold. I don't know whether you know P.P. Arnold, but she was originally with she came from San Francisco, and she's originally with Ike and Tina Turner's Ikettes, who were the sort of backing vocalists for the Ike and Tina Turner show. And the Ike and Tina Turner show came over to London to play some concerts. And P.P. Arnold, Pat Arnold, she's a beautiful person, beautiful, sort of friendly, outgoing character. And she immediately got sort of drawn into the London hip scene. And when Ike and Tina Turner went back to the States, she sort of stayed in England, and she got a record contract with Andrew Lowe Oldham, and she had a hit single with First Cut is the Deepest. That was the first one.
Oh, wow. The one, okay, interesting. I didn't know that.
And then, I say they all worked together in the studio. The Small Faces did a record for her called "If You Think You're Groovy," which has the Small Faces playing in the background, and she sings the vocals on the front. And of course, for Tin Soldier, I mean, she actually sings the high notes on Tin Soldier. And there's a brilliant video clip which you can easily find on YouTube of the Small Faces with P.P. Arnold standing there, and that is mesmerising. That's my favourite video clip of all time, and I've seen a hell of a lot of them, and that is brilliant. It's sort of, again, it's tight, it's economical. The guitar solo, it's sort of neat, and and it builds to a crescendo. It's a beautiful little production. And
it was written, I think Steve Marriott wrote it initially for P.P. Arnold.
Yeah,
but then they kept it.
Yeah, that sounds likely. Yeah, I mean, they toured with P.P. Arnold, and I say, whereas with Decca, they were sort of assigned an hour studio time, and they had to get in there, record the bass side, record the B side, get out. What Andrew Lowe Oldham gave them with Immediate was he gave them limitless studio time. They could, they sort of went in there and they could just play around with all the recording equipment, which is how Ogden's Nut Gone Flake came about.
The next album, yeah,
the next album, which I say was a classic album of the time, and it was a concept album to an extent. In fact, the second side sort of tells this sort of fairy story, which is a bit silly. But there again, some of the psychedelia stuff was silly. That was part of it. It was not meant to be sort of heavy or serious. I mean, I think.
Yeah. Well, what is behind that title, and what is the concept of that? Ogden's Nut Gone Flake.
I think in the 70s, prog rock got very serious, didn't it? Very sort of pretentious. But around the time of Ogden's Nut Gone Flake, there was still a playful element. One of the weird things about Ogden's Nut Gone Flake is it was issued in a circular tin. It didn't have a sleeve. It was circular, and it was modelled on smoking tobacco. Originally, when he went into the tobacconists, you didn't get cigarettes or whatever. You got a little tin of tobacco and you rolled your own. And that's what it was. Ogden's Nut Flake was a brand of tobacco, rolling, cigarette tobacco. And of course, again, there was like a bit of an in joke in there because when you roll your joint and you sprinkled it with cannabis or something, that was part of the in joke. But that's what it was based on. It was based on this.
Released in late May of '68. Yeah,
Yeah,
and it hit number 15 in June, and then climbed to number 1 by the end of June. Stayed there for 6 weeks.
I think it was number 1 in the UK charts at its most competitive. I mean, there was the Beatles, there was the Stones, there was the Who, there was everybody was around then, and also in America there was like Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, all that lot was starting up, and there was all this different definition of hip coming in. I mean, one of the things about being a mod was that it was exclusive, that you were different, you were, what I mean, you had that sort of cult appeal. But increasingly, mod got bigger and bigger and bigger, and everything was mod. Mod had its own magazines and all this sort of thing, and you felt, well, it lost that exclusivity. But instead, there was all this kind of psychedelia moving in, and that was even hipper, that was even trendier, so all these bands, little mod bands, they started psychedelicizing, and I suppose that's what the Small Faces did to an extent. They were sort of using studio technology.
And it had a big single, Lazy Sunday, from that album. That was a huge boost to the album sales, I'm sure. Yeah. And speaking of what does it mean? There's a line in that song, Lazy Sunday, which, by the way, Marriott and Lane wrote, Steve Marriott and Ronnie Lane. The line is, "I'll sing you a song with no words and no tune, to sing in the kazi while you suss out the moon." Please explain what that means.
I bet that would confuse American listeners. Yeah. Well, the second side of the album, right, is this sort of linked story where the moon goes missing. The guy comes out of his cave and the moon is gone. That is a reference in Lazy Sunday. I mean, the Small Faces didn't want that track to be issued as a single, although I think it's brilliant.
Wow. Yeah. Surprising.
But yeah, because I mean, they plunder the BBC effect discs. They had like discs with sound effects on, right? Which is where the sort of sound of the waves comes from, and the gulls and the bells and all that sort of thing. And they sort of used all those, to enhance Lazy Sunday. And yeah, I say that's the bit about Suss Out the Moon. That's a reference to the other side of the album. The Kazi is a name for in the old terraced houses, the old working class terraced houses in the UK. They had an outside toilet, right? You went out the back door, you went across the yard. The toilet was a separate building there, right?
Okay. Now I get it. They call it like a porta potty here in the US.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was called the Kazi. That was the, that was sort of slang term. You go to the Kazi. That means you go to the toilet. You go take a leak or whatever. So that's what that line means. You sit on the couch.
Andrew Darlington, he's the author of Small Faces and the Faces, every album, every song. Ogden's Nut Gone Flake, the last studio album under the original lineup. What led to Steve Marriott's departure?
They'd got trapped into the Decca contract, and now they were in the immediate contract. And I think Andrew Lowe Golding was well intentioned, but financially it was a bit of a shambles, and the whole thing sort of fell apart. I mean, I interviewed P.P. Arnold, and she was saying, well, they were left with no money. And in fact, the Small Faces, I mean, they continued litigation for years and years and years to get their rightful royalties. And in fact, eventually it was legally resolved, and they got the money. But by then, Steve Marriott was dead. It was like too late for him. So yeah, they were sort of signed to immediate, and say it was sort of falling apart around their ears. And the only way they could get out of the contract basically was by splitting up. I mean, they were contracted as the Small Faces. So Steve Marriott, he befriended Peter Frampton, who'd been in a band called The Herd, who'd had a few hits. And he wanted to sort of, he formed Humble Pie. So he sort of split off to form Humble Pie. And that was basically why the Small Faces broke up. I think it was sort of frustration in a sense that, they were stuck in that trap. I mean, there was one final single that was lifted from Ogden Look on Flake called Afterglow of Your Love, which I think is a brilliant track. But yeah, I say Peter Frampton and Steve Marriott formed Humble Pie, who sort of, I mean, they relentlessly toured America.
So then the rest of the guys, they don't know what's going to happen next. Enter Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood.
Yeah,
Yeah. So you quote Rod in a Melody Maker article. He says, "I never dreamed anyone in Britain would want to listen to me and Woody and three of the old Small Faces. They did, and so did U.S. fans. How did Rod end up joining Ronnie Lane, bassist Ronnie Lane, keyboardist Ian McLagan, and drummer Kenney Jones?"
Steve Marriott was a brilliant frontman. He was the lead guitarist, and he was also the vocalist, as well as co-writer. So they had to replace Steve Marriott basically, and Rod Stewart. He was an okay singer, but he couldn't play guitar. Ronnie Wood was a good guitarist, but he was not really a good vocalist. So to replace Steve Marriott, they brought in two guys. I mean, Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood had been together in the Jeff Beck group. You know that, don't you? I mean, Rod Stewart had been hanging around for a while, he had various singles, and Ronnie Wood had been in a band called the Birds. That's the Birds, not with a Y, with an I.
Right.
And yeah, they were in the Jeff Beck group together. And, yeah, because ironically, the one hit single in the UK that the Jeff Beck group had was Hi-Yo Silver Lining, which Mickey Most, the producer, I mean, Rod Stewart was a vocalist with the Jeff Beck group, but Mickey Most, the producer, he says, this time, I want to try Jeff singing this himself. So Jeff Beck actually sang Hi-Yo Silver Lining himself, and it was a hit. And they appeared on TV, and there was Rod Stewart, who was like supposedly the singer, and he was sort of standing at the back, pretending to do harmony vocals and things like that. It must have been kind of embarrassing for him.
I'm sure he loved that, right? Yes, because him and Jeff did not get along. There was the love-hate there. Great artistic combination, but they had their battles.
Yeah, I think Jeff Beck was always a difficult character. I mean, he was brilliant with the Yardbirds. And he had his definite, his vision of what what music should be. Yeah, because Rod Stewart was sort of self-conscious, and he didn't want to get up at first, but eventually he was sort of coaxed to sort of come along and sing, and they jammed on some old blues songs, and it worked, and it synthesized. Yeah, I got Rod Stewart's autobiography called Rod, and he kind of goes into it there. He's quite self-deprecating, quite sort of, quite amusing.
Well, this is as much as I enjoy the Small Faces, this is my favorite version of the Faces era, Small Faces and Faces. I just love Rod's voice and Ronnie Wood's contribution. That first album is called First Step. That was released in March of '70. Number 45 in the UK, 119 in the US, so they still had a little ways to go before they caught on in the US. The Flying is one of the singles, one of my all-time favorite Faces songs.
There's a track called My Way of Giving, which was originally done by the Small Faces, and then they did it with Rod Stewart doing the vocals, and you can compare the two vocals, and to me, I mean, Steve Marriott definitely has the edge on Rod Stewart. I mean, Rod Stewart is a good R&B shouter, and particularly like "Stay With Me." I think that's a brilliant, that's a brilliant rock and roll song. I mean, it was slaughtered by the feminist movement, because at that time the sort of feminist movement was sort of getting big, and basically "Stay With Me" is about, disrespecting a groupie, isn't it? I
Right.
mean. and the feminists slaughtered that. But there again, I mean, the Faces toured America relentlessly. I mean, there was an adage that the only way to break America was by touring relentlessly. That's the only way you can break, because it's such a big market that you got to tour. You got to tour. You got to be seen. So the Faces were there touring, and Humble Pie were touring. Simultaneously. And yeah, I thought "Stay With Me" was a brilliant song.
They were on their way, but it did take a while for them. They had to really work hard to gain a following under this new lineup, right?
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. They worked hard. I mean, there's this story that they, the other members of the group, they kind of suspected lead singers, because lead singers sort of used the band as a way of achieving fame.
Well, yeah,
And
that's interesting. Yeah, because Rod Stewart he's a
yeah,
solo artist while he's in Faces.
then they went off. Yeah, and then they went off and used that as a launch pad for their own solo careers, which Steve Marriott had done, and which again Rod Stewart did. Yeah, they were in a strange situation where they were signed to one label as the Faces, and Rod was also signed to another label as a solo artist. So they
What
both
what label was he under? I know Warner Brothers signed Faces. Was he under a different label?
in the UK, yeah, Phonogram, yeah. Going back to the beginning of rock and roll, Buddy Holly was in the same situation, because he was signed as the Crickets to one label, and
Right,
he was
right.
signed as Buddy Holly, a solo performer, to another label,
That
which is
could
which is why he managed to produce so much material
right.
within a short lifetime.
Mercury, it looks like here. Rod's
Yeah,
Gasoline Alley was under Mercury. Yeah. Boy,
yeah,
I didn't know it was under two different labels. So that's interesting. Yeah, it's kind of like it's like Phil Collins and Genesis going back and forth. But it did actually it helped with the single "Stay With Me" because I think that was right when or just after Maggie May became a hit. So it helped Faces for sure. The second album is 1971's Long Player, and that has a live cover of Paul McCartney's "Maybe I'm Amazed." And according to the book, his comment was funny. He says, "I didn't realize how good of a song it was until I heard the Faces do it."
yeah. And in all fairness, I mean, Rod Stewart does give it a really good live performance.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Bad and Ruin and Had Me a Real Good Time, my two favorites from that second album. Yeah, great statement you make in the book too. Quote, if you ever find yourself wondering why the Rolling Stones chose Ronnie Wood to complete their lineup, it's only necessary to listen to this strutting guitar-driven rocker to understand. Had Me a Real Good Time, I think you're referring to.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, as soon as Maggie May became an international hit, I think the writing was on the wall for the Faces. I mean, it's pretty inevitable from that point on that he would go his own way. I mean, on the Faces albums and on the Rod Stewart albums, there's pretty much the same sort of musicians. I mean, he sort of uses more studio musicians on his own albums.
You're right. Yeah, it sounds very Faces like those first few albums there.
Yeah, and I say they're a good time band. I mean, yeah,
And that third album goes to number 2 in the UK, top 10 US, and that is A Nod is As Good as a Wink to a Blind Horse.
yeah.
And what's behind that title?
Well, I mean, that's another sort of Cockney saying. It means between me and you, you understand, don't you? It's that kind of thing. A nod's as good as a wink to a blind. It's that kind of Cockney saying. Just like Carsey or something like that. Where they drag this kind of thing in, which is which is good. Yeah,
And
I think,
Stay With Me is in that collection of songs. Number 6 UK, 17 in the US.
yeah, yeah.
And they actually had gone further than the Small Faces ever did with this album, which is crazy. And as much as I love Stay With Me, my personal pick is Debris.
Mm.
Ronnie Lane, written and sung by Ronnie. And you write, quote, Ronnie sings a tribute to his bus driver father, Stanley Lane, amidst the hardscrabble East End Blitz debris. If you had to pick a favorite from this album, which would it be? Is it Debris? Is it a different one on that album? Is it Stay
No,
With Me?
I always had a lot of time for Stay With Me. I always like that one. Yeah, I mean, when it was the original Small Faces, it was all down to singles. You know, I mean, singles was the sort of common currency. You know, your single had to get into the charts. If you didn't get into the charts, you know, you're in trouble. But when you move into the 70s, when it was the Faces, things had moved on, and it was like albums that was the major thing then. You know, you had to be an album artist to be credible. You know, to get that sort of respect, that artistic respect. And yeah, I mean, I think Rod Stewart was a good R&B blues shouter, and he was good. You know, he was good with the Faces. But I think once he left, got into the disco stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
I I didn't like any of that. And that sort of when he did the Great American Songbook, you know, some of those are wonderful, wonderful written songs, you know, by top songwriters, and you need someone who knows how to interpret them. You know, like, I mean, I'm not a sort of Frank Sinatra fan, but Frank Sinatra knows how to work with an orchestra. He knows how to work with a lyric. He knows how to sort of interpret these songs. Rod Stewart doesn't. I mean, Rod Stewart is good doing R&B. He's good doing, raucous rock and roll. You know,
Yeah. Yeah. He reinvented himself a few times throughout the years. And it did pay off from a commercial standpoint, but I'm with you. I think I prefer the rocker Rod. You
yeah,
know?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
And I loved what he did when he worked again with Jeff back in the mid 80s, Infatuation, and then People Get Ready.
oh yeah, yeah.
Oh, amazing. Amazing.
And of course, all that time, Humble Pie was sort of dragging themselves around
Yeah.
America. You know,
Yeah.
and Peter Frampton left, and he sort of stumbled for a while, and then he sort of had that massive, massive album, didn't it? Massive live album. Whereas Steve Marriott was, I mean, and Humble Pie did some really good things. I mean, 30 Days in a Hole. I thought that was a
Great song. Probably their most well known here in the States. Yeah.
yeah. Although when it comes down to it, what he's talking about is he's bragging about all the drugs he's taking. If you listen to the lyrics,
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, that was his downfall, right? I believe alcohol and drugs became something that I believe didn't he died because he fell asleep after a long drinking night of long drinking and
yeah, that's.
his house caught on fire, I think is the story.
I mean, like in a way, I mean, getting a drugs bust was almost like a sort of a, a mark of prestige, you know. I
Right.
mean, the Stones had been busted and they'd been taken to court. George Harrison had been, up for drugs. You know, I mean, it was kind of a mark of prestige in a way, you know. So I think that day, that sort of track, 30 Days in a Hole, is it's a good track, but at the same time, I'm thinking he's sort of bragging about all the drugs he's taking, about the fact that he's been bussed by the police, and all this kind of thing, And then he did Black Coffee, which is another sort of very strong track. But I mean, he's trying desperately to sound black, and you think, well, you know, um, I thought we'd evolved beyond that, that you can only be what you can be, you can only be what you are, and
Yeah. I Don't Need No Doctors, another great track from Humble Pie, but I think that's probably about the same thing. Like, I don't need any help. I'm good. I'm fine.
yeah,
I'm fine.
and in a way, I mean, I say the Humble Pie dragged themselves around America, and they wound up at the end of the tour, and by the time all of the expenses were deducted, expenses for traveling, expenses for hotels, expenses for riders, which included, drugs and all this sort of thing, they were virtually left with no money.
Nothing left.
So Steve Marriott was stuck in that same position. He worked his ass off, and he got nothing for it. He got nothing for it.
Did you ever hear the rumor that he was among the people considered for the AC/DC gig after Bon Scott died?
Oh yeah, I mean, it
Would have been interesting.
would have been interesting. Yeah, yeah. You can almost see that happening, can't you?
Right, right. That final album, so it's the fourth and Final Faces album, Ooh La La, released March of 73, number one in the UK, 21, I think, in the US. Cindy Incidentally and the title track were the singles. Cindy Incidentally reached number two in the UK, 48 in the US. Title track didn't chart, but it's outlived Cindy Incidentally all these years later. Ronnie Wood wrote it with Ronnie Lane. And the only Faces recording to include Ronnie Wood on lead vocals. And I always wondered why Rod Stewart didn't sing on this version, but later record he recorded his own version for a later
Yeah.
record, in 1998. And that's explained in the book. So can you talk about why Ronnie Wood decided? Because I think Rod considered he was considered. He did a couple tries on lead, and he was the one who said, "Let's have Ronnie Wood do it."
Was a story that by that time Rod Stewart was getting more and more involved with his own career, and he turned up less frequently, for the Faces rehearsals and for the Faces recording sessions, and sometimes he wasn't there, so they had to make do with whatever was there, whatever personnel was there. So I think it could have been that as much as anything else. The fact that Rod just wasn't there, he was off with his making his own album.
Do you have
Which
a personal pick? Which version do you like? Do you like the Rod Stewart version or the one sung by Ronnie Wood?
no, no, I like the Faces version. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll the Faces version.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's just charming quality to it. Ronnie Wood's not a lead singer type, but it's a fun song. And I know here in the US in one of the commercials they did use the original version. I always thought it was Ronnie Lane singing. I had no idea for the longest time that it was Ronnie Wood.
yeah,
And
yeah. I mean, then Rod Stewart sort of went off solo. I mean, in his defence, they said, "Why did you leave the Faces?" And he said, "Well, by the time I left, there was no Faces left. They'd sort of broken up." And in fact, Ronnie Lane, he'd already begun to suffer from symptoms of his, disease that eventually killed him.
yeah,
So he'd been replaced by Tetsuya Yamashita. He'd been briefly with Free.
Tetsu Yamachu. Yeah, that didn't last long. And Ronnie Lane was frustrated from the aspect he wanted to write more, or he wanted more of his songs to be recorded. And then he went on to a really interesting solo career. I think he's did some great stuff. The album he did with Pete Townsend
Yeah, that's right.
is
Yeah.
fabulous. Yeah, but yeah, things went rapidly downhill for the Faces after Ronnie Lane quit. His boots were too big to fill, and eventually by the mid '70s, Faces came to an end. But Ronnie did quit because of the frustrations with songwriting. Because for him, the money wasn't that really wasn't on his mind. He was a true artist. I think he wanted to just express himself artistically. Is that
I think that was an important part of it. Yeah, I
yeah?
mean, of course, when you go into rock and roll, you go in for the girls and the drugs and the fame. But I think the artistic stimulus. I say it was a very highly competitive thing, and he wanted to be better than the other bands. He wanted to get that edge. So yeah, I think it was a sort of a competitive thing, and there was definitely an artistic thing. You wanted to be better than the other guy. You wanted to sort of make your mark. So yeah, I mean,
Did you
uh,
get to see the documentary on Ronnie Lane? There's a
yeah,
really good yeah
no, it was.
interesting character. He had the traveling. He went on tour. And he like a traveling circus type of thing where he didn't put on many shows, but he had this big idea to go around and travel around the country and
Troubadour, this sort of thing,
a
sort of,
troubadour type thing.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and we know Ronnie Wood goes on to join Stones and Rod Stewart solo success. Kenney Jones joined the Who after Keith Moon died, and sadly we've lost Ronnie Lane, Steve Marriott, and Ian McLagan. What do
Wait,
you?
sorry.
I was just what stands out to you the most when you look back on Small Faces and Faces? What do you think they should be remembered for most?
Well, I mean, I obviously loved them. They were part of my sort of evolving appreciation of music. And, I think they did some amazing tracks. I mean, All Out Nothing and Tin Soldier and, Lady Sunday. I mean, they are brilliant examples of that period of music, which was a sort of vital period when singles dominated the charts and the Beatles and the Stones and the Who and Small Faces and the Kinks and all that lot. I mean, they were all competing with each other, all trying to get one over on each other, Yardbirds, and then sort of moved into the 70s with the Faces when it was like Pink Floyd and all those bands. I mean, Led Zeppelin, obviously, and they were all competing in the same way. So yeah, it was an exciting period to live through. It was a brilliant period to live through.
What was your response to the news? And I sent you by email this news too. I'm sure you heard of it, but the new box set that collects all of the Faces BBC recordings from the early 70s. Did you hear about this?
Yeah, I mean, there has been a gradual sort of a leak of CDs collecting up, you know, BBC, radio tracks, and yeah, I mean they are invaluable because I mean, obviously it started off with the Beatles at the Beeb. I don't know whether you remember that one. It was like a CD
Right.
box, the
And
Beatles.
the Led Zeppelin BBC sessions are fantastic. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. 8 CDs, one Blu-ray box, 80 tracks. Um, what else is it saying here? Newly restored footage from April of 72. It's available September 6th, remastered with the participation of the Faces members, Rod Stewart, Ronnie Wood, and Kenney Jones.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, very often, I mean, they did stuff live that was never recorded, or they did versions or different interpretations of material that was never recorded. So it's interesting for us academics to hear those tracks. Yeah, I think it's valuable that the BBC is doing that, releasing all these old tracks out of the archives and bringing them back in, to people to hear them.
Really looking forward to it. Small Faces in the Faces, every album, every song. The book is out now in the UK through burningshed.com, and it does have a July 26th release date here in the States, Andrew, so people can find it through Amazon when that comes out here in the US next week, 26th of July, or wherever books are sold. And Andrew, where can people find you online if they wanted to reach out to you?
Yeah, there's Andy Darlington, andydarlington.com. I'm there.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to to chat, to talk, to communicate, whatever. You know, yeah, I mean the Small Faces book was a joy to research and a joy to write. I've got other books that I've written, musical. I did a book on Sly and the Family Stone. I did a book on the Hollies. I did a book on the Human League. Right now, I'm working on a book about the Yardbirds. So
Ooh, the Yardbirds. Okay, Jeff Beck.
yeah, that's going to be the next one.
Okay. Yeah, I did. I was lucky enough to interview their manager, Simon
Yeah,
Napier Bell. Very nice guy, and he had some great stories about Jeff Beck's time with the Yardbirds, and he said Jeff Beck was he was his own person. He they were there was one story about they were telling the guys in the band were telling Jeff how to do the song, or even just encouraging him. And he's just like, I don't need you guys to help me. He just struck one chord as if to say, screw you, I know what I'm doing.
yeah.
Man, Jeff Beck was a brilliant artist, and that was a shock when he passed. I mean, I don't
Oh,
know, nobody
yeah.
saw that one coming.
Yeah.
Too
I
bad.
mean, that movie, I don't know whether you know that movie Blow Up, Michelangelo
No,
movie, The Blow Up, where it actually features the Yardbirds in a club scene. And there's
no.
Jeff,
Okay.
and there's Jeff Beck and the Jimmy Page in the same lineup.
Yeah, that was a brief time there.
Yeah, and it's in there in the movie Blow Up, and they're playing in this mock-up of the club. And there's David Hemmings who comes in to watch the band, and there's Jeff Beck playing his lead guitar, and there's like a sort of buzzing sound on the amplifiers, and you can tell that Jeff Beck is kind of annoyed, and he goes and sort of bangs his guitar against the amplifier, and the sort of buzzing noise continues, and sort of a roadie comes out and starts fixing it, and there's Jimmy Page is there, and he's kind of watching what's going on like that. And Jimmy Page is getting more and more, Jeff Beck is getting more and more annoyed, and eventually he picks the guitar and he smashes it on the floor. It all clinches, and eventually sort of picks the guitar neck up and just throws it into the audience, and all the fans are fighting to get this neck, this guitar neck. I mean, probably it was staged for the movie. I don't know, but it just captures that sort of, you know, feeling about Jeff Beck that he
Sure.
was. Yeah.
Andy, thank you so much. Congratulations on the book, and all the best to you in the future endeavors with the next book on the Yardbirds. You know, you're welcome back here to talk about it. Would love to have you back on.
No, I've really loved talking to you. It's been really good.